So Tim, thank you for joining us on Contemplative Path.
Thank you for having me.
That's good. Could we just begin by your sharing with us what you would describe as the main elements in your life at the moment as Tim Kelly?
Well, let's say it's a combination of things. Certainly my family. We've been holed up together for the last few months, all five of us, and spending a lot of time together. Three kids are mostly grown. The youngest is in high school, and the oldest is working as a nurse at Johns Hopkins. And the middle child is still in college. So, and my wife is a teacher at a local girls' Catholic school. So that's one element. The other element is my work. I currently work at the Federal Office of Refugee Resettlement. I manage a grant program for services for survivors of torture. And the third element would be my connection to the world community for Christian meditation. I've been meditating in this tradition for about 17 years and have recently started to integrate it more into my work. So this intersection of refugees and meditation is something of great interest to me, and reminds me of a quote from Frederick Buechner. The idea of a vocation as being where your greatest desires meet the world's greatest needs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Tim. I'd like to explore with you how your work, your inner work, and with meditation over these past 17 years, and your work now with survivors of torture, especially people who've been deeply wounded and traumatized, and I'm sure take a long time to heal and recover, and how those two come together for you at a personal and also at a professional level. I know before you were working with the survivors of torture, you were working with refugees and immigrants into the US. And I remember speaking to you when you became an oblate of the world community about how you saw their situation and their struggle in terms of finding a new community, finding a new home, and finding acceptance and welcome. How have you, over the years, first of all with that particular group, and now with the survivors of torture, how have you found meditation has helped you with the professional work?
Yeah, I think it's helped me on a few different levels. I started, practicing different types of meditation around the same time I started working with refugees, and that was back in the early 90s. And I noticed, the people that I was working with had some significant mental health issues, and that often related to the trauma they had experienced, and they weren't being served by mainstream, providers, and that motivated me to go back and study clinical social work. And I focused on refugee mental health, but I also was learning about mind-body medicine and people like Herbert Benson, who was a pioneer in that field and wrote the relaxation response. And, I began to introduce that to clients as a way to help them, counteract the stress response. But I didn't do it on a deeper level until I started working with survivors of torture, which was in the early 2000s, I moved down to Baltimore and worked for a small organization, and I was the only social worker, and I was meeting with um, all of the clients at the time, almost all of them, and so it was a bit stressful because many of them were recently arrived and they were in need of a lot of assistance. A lot of them were in crisis, and so I recognized that I had to take care of myself, and I began to have this desire to find a practice that I could commit to, develop a discipline, a daily discipline. And that's when I came across the World Community for Christian Meditation. Um, and I was drawn to the teaching, um, because of really its simplicity. The recommendation to practice 20 to 30 minutes twice a day was something I felt like I could integrate into my life. And if it was any longer, I might have felt daunted by the task, and quickly abandoned the practice, before kind of experiencing the real healing effects of it. But like Saint Benedict, WCCM's teaching is not harsh or burdensome, and but it does involve a little bit of strictness, in order to establish the practice. And I first when I first started practicing, I was listening to John Main's talks on cassette, and almost every talk he emphasized the twice daily practice and every day, and so that's what got me started.
Mm. So I can understand how dealing with every day with people who your heart must just go out to because of the stories they tell you and because of the suffering they're going through and of the needs that they have and the confusion perhaps that they feel. And I could understand how meditation must give you an inner stability and inner strength and detachment to be able to deal with that without getting sort of coldly professional, remaining human, but also keeping a necessary detachment.
Yeah, that's certainly true. I think one thing I talk to service providers about is the importance of compassion, in our work. Most healing takes place in the context of a relationship, and you need to be present to the other person if you're really going to develop that trusting relationship with the person, to be able to listen to them even when the stories are very traumatic as well, but also to be able to let go of those stories and those details at the end of the day. So I think that's what meditation helped me to do, is to be present to the people I'm serving, but also to let go of any any difficult thoughts or feelings that had arisen during the day.
Mm. I could imagine a difference, say, between working with refugees or asylum seekers who may be fleeing from war or persecution, but have sort of chosen to try to escape and start a new life. But working with victims of or survivors of torture must make you wonder sometimes about the essential goodness of human nature when you hear these stories of the inhumanity of man to man and of what just sheer sadistic cruelty we can inflict on each other. Has it shaken your belief that we are all created in the image of God?
It certainly challenged me to go deeper, and to question, what I had to offer these people. And my colleague Richard Malika at the Harvard Program in Refugee Trauma often talks about how his clients are his teachers, and they teach him, how they were able to survive and cope, in the midst of, the torture or whatever they were experiencing, and also in the aftermath of it. And I think it's very true. There's a certain sense of humility, I think, that is needed, in working with these folks and recognizing that we're, both on this healing journey together. And especially, in this time of the COVID crisis, it's something that impacts us all.
Yeah.
And so I remember early on when I was at this conference for survivors of torture, and it was at Catholic University, in fact, but it was the organization was not religious. And there was a woman up there speaking, and behind her was the crucifix. And, at that point, it kind of dawned on me that, well, Jesus was a torture victim, and, that's when kind of I began to kind of connect the faith element to the experience that these folks were going through. And, and even, torture is something that is meant to instill fear in the community, and so that the government can control and oppress people. And as you've said before, the way of the cross was just that. It was the way the Romans kept the people in line, fearing that they would be next. I think the people that survive are similar to those that are those disciples in the upper room behind locked doors, and experiencing great fear. And I think the practice of meditation helps to, breathe new life, into them, and help them to heal from that traumatic experience and move on with their lives.
That's a very profound insight. I've always thought of torture primarily in terms of something that's done in a dungeon, in a very secret and dark place. But you've emphasized the sort of the public policy aspect of it, that this has to be made public if it's going to have the effect that you say upon making a population more pliable and compliant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's unfortunately it's practiced in too many countries at this time. So a lot of the grantees that I work with, they do advocacy around, to abolish the practice of torture. And we just celebrated 2 days ago the UN Day in support of victims of torture. So the United Nations is very involved in this movement, and the U.S. government has been giving money to serve survivors of torture since 2000, that was the funding that the organization that I worked for back in the early 2000s received, and it's the same program that I'm now managing. So it's been nice to be able to be on both ends of it,
So Tim, I'd like to ask you now to speak about how you've described how meditation helps you in your work with the survivors of torture. How have you been able to share meditation with them directly, personally, and how do you feel that is working? I mean, you've started, I know, a number of meditation support groups for refugees and survivors of torture. Has it been well received? And do you find that the practice of meditation really gets into the healing of trauma?
Yes, at first I was, I was teaching kind of the relaxation response, and taking a more, physiological approach to it, and I was a bit hesitant to teach meditation as a spiritual practice, in a secular setting. But now I simply encourage people, as they do at the John Main Center and other programs within Meditatio, to connect the practice to their own tradition, their own faith tradition, wisdom tradition, and just be faithful to the practice. So that's been, my approach, and I've been able to share it, in an interfaith context with colleagues and with service providers, as well as refugees and survivors of torture. And a few years ago, we started a pilot project in 2 organizations in DC in collaboration with the John Main Center and the director.
Just say what the John Main Center is.
Oh, I'm sorry. The John Main Center at Georgetown University. It's the Center for Meditation and Interreligious Dialogue. And so this was kind of an outreach project where we worked with 2 organizations that worked with refugees and survivors of torture. And we started by teaching it to the staff, and then helped them to offer it to the people that they served. And the feedback was very positive. It was time limited, but the feedback was positive, and it encouraged me to develop a format where we could share this on a wider level. And so I'm still in the process of developing it. But as you mentioned, we've started some online meditation support groups in collaboration with a program in Texas. And the support group, it's not a therapy group. There is a therapist available who is there to support, folks who may need it or follow up with them. But it's very similar to the WCCM meditation group, except, in this particular group, the individuals speak Nepali and French. They're from Bhutan and the Congo. And so there are 2 interpreters as well. And most of the clients are long-term clients, and they're no longer highly symptomatic. And however, they still have a need to, for support and want to feel connected to the program. And especially in this time, they're isolated in their rooms or in their houses, and this gives them a chance to come together. And they like meditating with people from different traditions as well. So.
Yeah. Are they mostly single individuals, or
couples as well? Yeah, there are some couples that come together, but I'd say the majority are singles. Yeah.
So how do you actually introduce them to the practice? So you advise them to choose a word, a mantra from their own tradition, for example, or otherwise it's basically the same, isn't it?
Yeah. When I introduce the mantra, I encourage them to find a word that's meaningful to them, and preferably in their own tradition. And I might offer a few different words in different traditions, depending on where the clients are coming from. In this particular group, I'd say most of them are Christian, and those from Bhutan, many of them converted to Christianity after moving to Texas. A charismatic pastor who, and they've got a thriving community there. So, I also introduced Maranatha as as a word that has become used in different traditions. It was as you know, a Christian sacred word, but is also relevant to those from Jewish and Muslim traditions as well.
Mm. Mm. And so you meditate together for what, 20 minutes?
We're working up to 20 minutes. So we've got 15 right now. We seem to run out of time with the three languages being spoken,
Uh,
and um, but yes, I think we're at the point where people could easily do 20 minutes.
and what's the feedback that you get from them? Are they able to give that feedback to you?
I guess the biggest feedback is they come back, each week. But I give people a chance to check in at the beginning of the group, and folks have commented on how helpful this has been and how they've been practicing on their own, and that it has helped them to feel more relaxed. But I think they're also sensing that there's a deeper change beginning to happen within them. I mean, once you discover a practice like this, it's a gift, and you want to continue to do it. And so in some ways, I think it's given them new hope, in a time when there's a lot of uncertainty and and difficulty.
And of course, the meditation, which, as you say, they are introducing into their own lives, meditating on their own. So the support group is really a support for what is becoming a daily practice, hopefully.
Exactly. Yeah. And I was describing that to them recently, that this weekly group is basically to support them in their practice, and that we're encouraging them to develop their own practice. And I usually share a short reading, one of the daily readings, and um, that's more interfaith in its message, and highlight a couple of key points from that reading, and then we end with a poem. And so I think it's helpful for people to kind of end the group with that sense of peace that
Mm.
they experience with meditation, then they can go about their day.